until we make the unconscious conscious, it will determine our lives and we'll call it fate. That's what we're dealing with here. We've got to make the unconscious conscious. We've got to bring it to the forefront of what we're doing. Welcome to the Freedom Project podcast. My name is Tom Foxley, and this podcast is here to help you become who you're meant to be, to really step into that version of you that you know is lurking in the background, but maybe you've only just glimpsed until now. So if you're into all things self-mastery and living deliberately and intentionally and creating freedom for yourself, both real world freedom in terms of your time and how you spend it and your energy, but also freedom from limits, your self-imposed limits and unnecessary limits, then this is the podcast for you. Today, what we're going to be covering is part 3 of the ultimate guide to discipline. And if you haven't covered the last 2 episodes of this, I would highly recommend you go and check those out. Reason being is we really lay the groundwork for this conversation that we're going to have here in this training. First thing we cover is that discipline often occurs in this cyclical behavioral pattern, that we go through these cycles and that we never really break through of them. It's like we're trapped in the same loop with life trying to teach us the same lesson over and over again, but yet we don't learn it. We don't pick it up. Next thing we talked about, and we also there talked about depth as well, actually, in the first episode. We really covered about, or why we have to start looking at this in a more deeper, nuanced perspective, instead of just trying to use willpower to drive us, force us through this issue, because we have used willpower a bunch of times and it hasn't worked, right? So we covered that. Then in the previous episode, what we talked about is the nervous system and how this apparently unrelated, or at least complex system has a direct impact on how we're disciplined and how we're probably lacking discipline, and how this is an absolute priority for us. And then also how correct regulation or optimal regulation of our nervous system helps us engage with challenge, helps us be more disciplined, become more productive, and essentially stop defaulting to these negative patterns of behavior. Today, I'm going to touch on, well, not just touch on, I'm going to give you everything that you need to know to really gain a picture of where you're at around psychology and the role that psychology has on discipline. What this is not is a comprehensive discussion on every role that psychology plays in this. I'm not a psychologist. However, this will serve as a comprehensive discussion if you are an adventurepreneur, or if you are trying to become the person you really want to be, and you're interested in those 3 things that I mentioned earlier: self-mastery, living intentionally, and creating freedom for yourself. So let's start this off with a little discussion and a kind of furthering of what we've already talked about. The first thing to mention is that we've so often become too conscious in the way that we try and approach this. All we try and do is use the rational, conscious mind to force ourselves through this problem. This is very much like use the willpower approach. We're just using this willpower, and I get it. It's a great tool to have. Trust me, when I was in the Royal Marines, I used a lot of this willpower. In fact, it was the only tool I had, and it served me really well in that. When I can think of multiple experiences in training where I was like, I have to force myself to do this because I just don't want to, and I've hit this limitation. I can also think of stages in early business where it was exactly the same. I had to force myself. I had to use willpower to push myself through those limits when I just didn't want to. However, I hit those limitations eventually, and it didn't serve me forever. That's because it's just one tool in our toolbox. We have to start picking out the other tools. We have to start getting a screwdriver on the job or a hacksaw on the job rather than just hitting every nail with the hammer. The thing is, society really valorizes this part of our psychology, this willpower. We worship the war heroes. We worship the athletes who display discipline. We truly worship this element of psychology. And when we start thinking about the unconscious, it all comes across as a bit wishy-washy, and it all comes across as a bit nebulous. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I just switch off when I hear someone talking about that. So I want to make this clear and practical because that's the way my brain works. I don't often deal in the magical and the mystical, although I'm open to them. I want something structured and practical, as much as we can structure this very difficult to structure thing. The other thing that can happen is there's things in the unconscious that we do not want to uncover. However, if you're aware of them, and if they're truly causing limitations in your life, going around them just creates more problems in the long term. And trust me, I've been there. I've tried to push away many things that I'd rather not have felt. And I've definitely seen so many clients do exactly the same. At some point, though, we've got to confront them. And the only way to overcome them is through. We've got to go through those parts of us that we'd rather not explore. And as uncomfortable as it is, and as downright painful as this is, it's worth it. Because that's your way to grow. The obstacle really is the way. So let's talk about the unconscious and the conscious mind. The conscious mind is that we are directly aware of. The thoughts that we can pick up easily, the experience that we can kind of point to. And it's a very kind of egoic state, so I'm aware of it, and it's the I. It's the kind of the thing that I think of as me. And then we have the unconscious. The unconscious is kind of that we are either barely aware of or totally unaware of. And we'll get to why we have the unconscious mind in a second. But the unconscious mind is said to, there's so many studies around this, but it's said to dictate 70, 80, 95%. It's a lot of your behaviors and what we do. No one can really know this, I don't think. From everything that I've looked at, everyone's just kind of guessing, and there's no direct study at it. But it's this insanely powerful part of your mind, of your experience. The unconscious is determining so much of what we do, so much of why we do it. And because of that, it not only holds our limitations, but it holds the opportunities to grow that we are desperately seeking for in the conscious realm, but we're not going to find them because they are in the unconscious. So if you've ever been bouncing against a glass ceiling in your business, in your training, in your relationships, just running into the same old problem time after time after time after time, the unconscious very well could be a real thing to overcome for you, an objective, something to explore. And especially if you've done the work, or at least some work, of regulating your nervous system, then the unconscious is where we need to start looking. So let's talk about stories, first of all. Our stories are what's known as the personal unconscious. And the personal unconscious is, think about it like it's your personal unconscious. It's your experiences. It is your life, your particular experience of life, and a load of other things that I will discuss in a second. But it's all about you. This is unique to you. We store things in the unconscious because if we had to remember everything about them, they would be so overwhelming. If you had to remember every salient memory ever, all the detail that went into it, all of the all of the kind of magnification of all the experiences, it would be exhausting. You just wouldn't have the space. So what our mind does is it plays it through over and over and over and over again, and then shrinks it. And it shrinks it into the format that is most deeply resonant with us human beings. And that's the form of a story. Think about it. We stare and hallucinate whilst we do so at sheets of dead tree whilst we read stories. We stand or sit in a dark theatre and watch light projected on a screen. And we watch the story. We tell kids our stories. We share all our experiences through stories. We're captivated by stories. Because this is how we best encode our information. It's a distillation of all our of all our events, are condensed and distilled into stories. So we tell ourselves stories and we become captivated by these stories. And these are stories, they don't just stay as memories, they become our reality. This simplification we live out. It's not the story as a whole. It's the shortened, truncated, simplified, and often intensified story that we end up living out. And that can be problematic because life is nuanced and there are subtleties. But our mind likes to go, hey, no, we are doing this as a binary thing. It's black or white. This is the way that this is. And it's often very categorical. No way. This, like, I am someone who is never going to be good enough. The world is out to get me. I can't trust myself. These kind of stories. We form stories when we expose them to repetition and emotion. So there's this lovely Earl Nightingale quote, and I'll be honest, other than knowing he's a radio presenter, I don't know what he did, but he's got a great quote about this that sums it up quite nicely, which is, what we nourish with repetition and emotion becomes our reality. And that's because the more emotion, positive or negative, but negative is more powerful in this, that surrounds our experiences, the more likely they are to be stored in the unconscious. Why the unconscious? Because we can't just keep everything at the front of our mind the whole time. We have to store it at the back, where it's not in the way. We need to free up that conscious mind to do, frankly, more interesting things. So if we surround it by emotion and nourish it with emotion, that becomes our reality. And that's a negative thing and a positive thing. Because say you have something awful happen to you, that becomes your reality. However, we can rewrite this intentionally by using that emotion. And I'll tell you how in a second. On the other side of this, we have the repetition. So if something happens to you once, it's unlikely to be categorized as a story. If something happens to you 1,000 times, maybe that becomes a story, even if it's the wrong story. Because these stories are often these jumps to conclusion. They are not reality. They are 1 + 1 = 5 often. And logically, rationally, consciously, they don't make sense. But in the realm of the unconscious, they do. And they become our reality. So there are 4 things that really create these stories. Firstly, they all start with E, by the way, and I've talked about them previously, but I think this is a nice place to really bring them into the subject and discuss them deeply. So, evolution. Things that are built into us evolutionarily, you can think about this biologically, like a predisposition and a sensitivity to negative experience, are really powerfully built into our stories. And that's not necessarily personal unconscious, but it can be kind of reinforced. So, evolution. Experience. That which has happened to you. Your wins and your losses. Education. What you're explicitly told. So this is what you're said is true about the world and untrue about the world. And then environment. An environment is the most powerful of these. What you're implicitly taught about the world. Something that you're never explicitly told, but you pick up. It's the 1 + 1 = 5. Think about these like breaking trail through snow. The first time that you have to walk. So in ski touring, we call it building a skin track. Okay, so you skin up behind the person. You kind of, your skis fit in their ski tracks, and it's easier for the second person because the person who's breaking trail, the person who's laying down the skin track, has to really truly work incredibly hard. But the second person finds it a lot easier, third person easier still. By the time you get to the 20th person, it's the easiest path that you can ever follow. So that's what happens in our mind. When the same story fires again and again and again and again, it's enriched by those emotional states, and it comes from one of those 4 E's, then it becomes way more likely to be nurtured into reality. And here's the way that actually happens. We often think about success being caused by actions and behaviors, and of course that's entirely correct. Whether we succeed in creating the life we want or not is down to what we do, and there's some outside factors in that, of course. But if we take the kind of clean example of weightlifting, we can imagine that, well, we just have to train hard, and our training consistently and intentionally, if we're putting the right stimulus in, will create the response. But what actually creates the actions? I don't mean the program that you're following, but more, how do you enact the program? Do you actually put all the reps in? Do you commit to them fully? Do you kind of commit to the program as a whole? Do you trust in yourself? Do you back that? Do you actually do the sets and reps, and do you rest correctly, and do you follow the percentages? That's created not by logic often, but the emotions surrounding it and the thoughts surrounding it. In other words, our subjective experience. If I'm telling myself that there's no point in doing this over and over and over and over again, then it's very unlikely that I'll do it. And they are all created by our beliefs and our stories. We can say they're the same things because stories are just a representation of our beliefs. Our stories are our truth. And let's go back to that Jung quote that I've mentioned previously in these series. Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will determine our lives, and we'll call it fate. That's what we're dealing with here. We've got to make the unconscious conscious. We've got to bring it to the forefront of what we're doing. So let's just talk about how this impacts productivity and discipline and focus and self-regulation. If you believe that if you make your business a success, you'll start losing the connection and love that your family have for you, and you believe that unconsciously, you will struggle to be disciplined because you'll constantly be running that in the background of your mind, and you'll probably barely glimpse it. It'll be difficult to hone in on it initially. So that's what we can do there. We become aware of it. The second thing, what if we kind of believe that you don't deserve help or assistance? Will you always try and be independent? And because of that, you'll never ask for help. You'll never enlist in coaching or support or guidance or mentorship. If you believe I am no good at fill in the blank, sales, marketing, relationships, love, training, nutrition, consistency, then that becomes your reality. If you believe I don't deserve this, that affects your thoughts and emotions that surround the entire task, and then that becomes your reality. We have to escape these black holes. And that really is the way that I see these. I see them as black holes, and with black holes there's something called the event horizon. And the event horizon is basically a point that if you go past, nothing can escape. And our stories have this gravitational pull just like a black hole. And we'll never escape them. We'll never escape this orbit unless we can reduce the size, the heaviness, the mass of that black hole. It will stop pulling us in. Or we can increase our momentum out. So the first thing we have to do is become aware of these stories. We have to bring them out from the unconscious. And then we have to reduce their magnitude by becoming aware of them, by seeing them clearly, by taking them out of the unconscious and placing them in the conscious mind, or we have to generate enough momentum to move out of them. But we can't do that if the stories remain unconscious, because you don't know which direction to go. So that is one part of the story, our unconscious stories. The next piece is something that I always thought of, not necessarily as woo-woo, but I just didn't understand. And I think when I give you the first term associated with this, it will come off as a little bit woo-woo. This is the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious isn't this idea that we are sharing a conscious experience and that we can all communicate telepathically. The collective unconscious is something that's not personal to you, but it's just kind of built into humans. So we all have these models, and I'm going to take you through a little bit of an example today about the kind of the masculine archetypes of this. So Carl Jung was one of the first people to really popularize this, and what he said is essentially there's parts of our mind that are waiting for the right environment to come alive in, waiting for the right conditions, waiting for the right stimulus to show themselves. They're awaiting activation. So they're waiting not only for that environment, but also to be nurtured and to be shown forwards. So often, if we are struggling to make decisions or be assertive, or we've got a fear of confrontation, or we are seeking validation, approval, or struggling to press our emotion, this can be not a story, but the fact that we haven't trained these unconscious archetypes. Sometimes these archetypes don't fully evolve because we have like low resolution images of them. So what I mean by that is we haven't identified clearly what a great version looks like. Maybe there's cultural reasons, or the personal unconscious gets in the way, or maybe there's a fear of the shadow part that I'll explain in a second, or we just have a misunderstanding, or we don't want to, like, we've got resistance or fear to changing. And quite often it's because there's like kind of no guidance or mentorship or kind of good role models that show us. So we're currently at a point, for example, where masculinity is associated with two things: exploitative capitalism, so anything masculine is associated with that, and then like the kind of Andrew Tate lot. And this is just like an inaccurate perspective on the masculine archetypes. What we need to do in order to integrate these into ourselves, and I'll show you why they're essential in a second, is we need to integrate them into us. We need to develop a high resolution image of these masculine archetypes. There's a few key principles before I explain them, and I'm not going to go into full depth, but the first thing is that we're not creating something new. We're bringing alive something that's already there. It's dormant within us. It's latent. It's ready to be activated. And you do this by developing awareness. You don't kind of unconsciously magically appear. You have to become consciously aware of these unconscious things. It's a very similar thing to the stories. And the next thing is we can talk about progressive overload. You train this systematically and progressively, just like in the gym. You can put the reps into displaying these parts of us. We also have to accept the shadow part of each of these unconscious archetypes. There's this Alexander Solzhenitsyn quote: "The line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being." And we all have the capacity for the shadow parts of this. You have it. I have it. And if you don't articulate it fully and you continue to suppress it, it'll push back against you and it ruins you. And then the other piece is you need all of these in order to truly live. And these are the masculine archetypes. The king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. So the king is there ready to kind of take leadership. It's about order, it's about structure, it's about wisdom, it's about stability. And if you don't have it, you might struggle with things like purpose and direction, or kind of like really stepping in to take responsibility. Those are huge in terms of discipline, right? And then we have the shadow side of it too. The shadow side has an excess and deficiency side. So one is like too much of this energy, one is not enough of this energy. The excess is like the tyrant. So when it comes to being disciplined, this will be being highly domineering and oppressive and authoritarian to yourself. It will be ultra controlling. The weakling will be someone who's indecisive and ineffective and passive and lacking authority. And what you might find is that you fluctuate between those. The only way you get yourself to do anything is by being domineering and oppressive and like an authoritarian. And then that becomes too much because you're not embodying the true side of it. So you become indecisive and ineffective and very passive, and you stop taking action. So to cultivate this, you identify your values, you take ownership, you can practice some philosophy in there, and you lead. You lead your life and you lead other people. The warrior is the next one. The warrior is responsible for discipline itself, but also courage and setting boundaries, both for yourself and other people, for focus and resilience, and also committing. If you don't have this, often you find yourself procrastinating. If you haven't embodied it, integrated it fully into yourself, you often procrastinate, you struggle with the routine, you struggle with the lack of discipline, you don't take that action, and you're overly passive. The shadow sides to this are the sadist. So that's someone who's, again, you might see yourself fluctuating between these. The sadist is someone who's aggressive and cruel and merciless and enjoys causing pain to other people, and then also to themselves. And then the masochist is someone who's submissive and self-sacrificing and meek, and they have an inability to assert themselves. So to cultivate the warrior, we need to set discipline goals, and we'll cover more of what that looks like in the next step of this in part 4. Practicing assertiveness, doing physically and mentally tough things, and engaging positively with conflict. So those are the two big ones in these archetypes. And these archetypes are waiting to be activated, like I said. There's the magician, which is part of it. And that's kind of like the wisdom and insight piece, someone who's got a deep understanding of the world. Now, usually it's associated with your financial or career success. It's not really a huge one here. But the lover is a little bit, and the lover is responsible for empathy and compassion and connection and an appreciation for the beauty of all moments and meaningful relationships and intimacy and awareness. And because of this, it's usually the inward lack of this that we don't have. So we need to develop the archetype to show this to ourselves, really show the collective unconscious, show the archetype and develop the archetype. So that's a little bit about this. This isn't, like I said, a complete guide. This isn't with the exercises. However, there's some useful stuff here. And I just want to share with you the actual process that I take people through. And hopefully you can start applying this for yourself. But also if you want some assistance, I'll kind of give you a framework for this right now. And if you want to ever talk about the Adventurepreneur Collective or engaging in my coaching in any way, then this will give you an idea for the way that we'd work through this. And by the way, the Adventurepreneur Collective is full for April. I'm recording this on April the 22nd. We actually filled up on April the 17th. We're getting more and more busy. There is already one person signed up ready for the May intake. So things are getting busy. If you want to get involved, then we can absolutely talk about it. But anyway, that wasn't supposed to be a pitch. Here's the framework if you were to work with me, the kind of what I would take you through. It's kind of a 4-step psychological process. Test, aim, presence, and proof. TAPP, TAP. In the testing phase, what I'll do is I'll take someone through a questionnaire. I'll have a conversation, a deep kind of like onboarding conversation with them as their first call. And I'll set them a bunch of journaling tasks. From this, I will be looking at it both from the lens of the archetypes and from stories. There's other things we test as well, like the nervous system and a few other elements. But those are the things I'm looking for. So I'm looking for a questionnaire. I'm looking for a kind of feel from the conversation. And I'm looking at journaling prompts as well. And I've looked at, God, I dread to think how many words I've read of journaling prompts, but I've read a lot and I've experienced a lot of these people. And I've worked with thousands of people, probably just like you, and experienced all these things. So I can get this kind of awareness and pick it up pretty easily. It's almost impossible to do it from within. You need some guidance. You need someone who's been there before. So we test. The next step I often create for them is aiming. Aiming at a variety of different goals. And by variety, I don't mean in all areas of life, although that could be it. I mean, we build up what I call nested goals. That means at the top tier, we have a unifying purpose. What is the purpose of your existence right now? Knowing that this will fluctuate and change, and you want it to grow and you want it to adapt, but what's your unifying purpose right now? All the way down to how do I act in each moment? In between that, we have like a vision, values, we have 3-year goals, 12-month goals. We really build out this comprehensive, like, I know what I'm doing, I know what I'm working towards type guide. Build up those. We focus a lot on the vision, and then I give them workbooks to fill these out. Like, so it's actual structure. It's not just come up with it yourself. There's processes and keys there. From there, we create. So what's actually happening at that point is like, oh, I know what's my kind of deficiencies are in this area. I know why I'm struggling to be more productive. I've got this reason to go, and I know what I want to create, and that truly resonates with me, and I'm excited to go after it. What happens at that point is we often run into difficulties and struggles, and this is normal, and this is actually what we want to happen, because then we can use this to generate that awareness, that presence. So that's what the P stands for. And this is kind of a non-meditation exercise. It's something that I've developed before. I'm not going to go into it right now because it would be far, far, far too long. But that's where we really dive into generating true awareness. We work on the archetypes. We generate awareness of these concepts that I'm not going to explain right now, but it's really awareness of the present moment so that you have control over what I'm doing right now, because so many of us have a lack of presence. And then the final step is proof. If you think back to repetitions and emotions creating our reality, we do things again and again and again and again that disprove the old story and prove the new story to be correct. We reinforce that by wrapping it in emotion, and we often perform a tool called the AMWAP, as many wins as possible, just writing this down, reinforcing them. So that is a comprehensive guide to the psychological aspect, at least the frameworks of developing productivity and discipline. Some of you may be thinking, hey, what about CBT? Because there's parallels to what I'm doing in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a behavioralist approach as a whole. This for me is where the line between psychology and philosophy starts to blur. So it's something that I'll be covering next week. And it's a really key aspect. I'm not a CBT practitioner, but there are parallels between what I do and CBT. So I'll be discussing that. And next week I'll be going into a complete approach to the philosophy of discipline. So that's adding structure to your week, and it's really applying not just stoicism, but a few other pieces that I want to explain to you. So that is all coming up very, very soon. I'm well aware that I've hit half an hour already, but if you have questions, I would love to hear them. Shoot me a follow on Instagram, so search for Tom Foxley, and when I've got time in these podcasts, I will cram in your questions and really get around to answering some and applying it for you. So shoot those questions over to me. It'll be a pleasure to hear. I've already got a couple kind of banked up, so send them over. It'd be absolutely great to hear from you. Just remember, if you haven't subscribed already, it'd be a fantastic thing to do, because you'll get all the new episodes and all that kind of stuff, but you know how to use Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. So head on over, hit subscribe, follow, whatever it is, and I'll see you for another episode of the Freedom Project podcast.